In the quiet town of Middleton, near Manchester, England, the summer of 1976 was unusually warm. The heat had a way of hanging in the air, thick and stifling, even as night fell. And for Maria Jameson, this particular August night would be etched into her memory forever. Not just for the suffocating heat, but for the nightmare that would blur the lines between reality and horror. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Mystery Files. Thank you so much for joining me once again. I got actually a couple good stories for you today.
3 stories.
And the more as we lead up to Hell Month or Hell Week in October, I'm going to bring you more and more stories, which might mean more than one a week. And don't forget, we also have one brand new story every week on my new channel, Shadows in the Wild. And also don't forget, I just put out my podcast on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, and all the links are in the description. An exclusive Mr. E-Files episode goes out there, along with 2 remastered ones every week as well. So what are you doing? Go watch this. Soon it'll be 7 stories a week. I'm doing it all for you. I love you guys. But that's enough ado. Without any further ado, as of now, it's time to slip into a mind that's not our own. Let's go. Maria was a woman with a routine. Every night she would close the curtains in her modest living room, tidy up the few dishes left over from dinner, and make her way down to bed at about 10 p.m. At this point, her husband George had already retired to the bedroom, claiming that a headache had worn him out earlier on. And it was unusual for George to go to bed before Maria, but she thought little of it. I mean, the two had been married for almost a decade, and while their relationship was not one of fiery passion, it was stable. That night, the air inside their house was particularly stifling. Even with the windows fully up, Maria could feel her sweat gathering on her brow as she laid down right next to George. She could tell that his breathing was slow and steady, and she found kind of comfort in that familiar sound, which lulled her into sleep. In fact, it lulled her into a deep sleep. But her sleep was far from peaceful, because Maria had a dream. And in her dream, Maria found herself standing in the middle of a darkened room, its boundaries indistinct, as if the walls were just constantly shifting and receding into the shadows. Her spine, despite the warmth that she had just felt moments ago. And in her dream, the air was thick with this metallic scent, and it was blood. And she felt this ominous presence right behind her. She tried to turn and see what it was, but her body just wouldn't obey. It's almost like she was in sleep paralysis, or she was just paralyzed, as if some force was just holding her in place. Then the scene of the dream shifted suddenly. Now she was laying down, her body pressed against something hard and cold, and she tried to move, but once again found herself restrained, unable to lift her arms or even cry out. So panic surged through her now as she realized that she was not alone. A dark figure loomed right over her. Its features were obscured by this kind of shadowy presence, and she could hear the ragged breathing of this figure as it leaned in closer, its cold breath brushing up against her ear. And in her dream, the figure raised something metallic, catching the light faint, and it looked like a knife. Maria could see the blade glinting in the darkness as it was brought down towards her chest. In her dream, the first stab came, and it was absolutely excruciating. She felt the knife pierce her skin, sending waves of radiating pain throughout her body. She wanted to scream, to thrash, to fight back, but her body refused to cooperate. And there were more stabs, and each stab brought a new wave of pain, more intense than the last, as if the knife was being twisted and driven deeper with each plunge into her, and now blood soaked her clothing, pooling around her as this figure continued its relentless assault. And at this point, the pain was so intense, so encompassing that she could no longer distinguish between reality and the nightmare that she was in. All she knew was the overwhelming agony and the certainty that she was going to die. But at that moment, something deep inside Maria started stirring. A primal instinct, you could say. A will to survive. And it took hold. She managed to focus on the faint sound of the clock ticking somewhere in her dream. And it was deep, deep in the distance. And she kind of used that as a tether to pull herself back to reality. With every ounce of strength that Maria had left, she forced herself to wake up, her consciousness clawing its way out of a nightmare's grip. And then, almost like a light switch, she jolted awake, her body drenched in sweat, her heart pounding furiously in her chest. And for a moment, she thought that she was still dreaming because, the room was dark and the oppressive atmosphere from her nightmare still lingered. And then as she gasped for air, once she popped up, she felt this sharp, searing pain in her chest. And that's when, her hand instinctively flew to the source of the pain, and her fingers slowly came away, and she realized that her chest was wet and sticky. This liquid on her hand seemed foreign at first, but then she soon realized, oh my God, it's blood. It wasn't a dream. The nightmare was real. Maria's eyes snapped open fully, and she found herself staring into the wild and frenzied eyes of her husband, George. He was on top of her, his face contorted with rage and madness, his hand gripping the handle of a kitchen knife. The realization hit her like a freight train. George was now trying to kill her, just as she had seen someone in her nightmare try to kill her. So adrenaline just surged through Maria's veins, overriding the pain and the shock that she was in. And she knew she had only seconds to act before George struck again. So with a strength that she did not know she possessed, she grabbed his wrist, desperately trying to wrench the knife from his grip. And of course, George at this point fought back, pushing the blade closer and just closer to her chest. But Maria refused to give in. She contorted and twisted her body with all of her unexpected strength, managing to roll out from under him and then fly off the bed. And she hit the floor hard, but the pain barely registered at this point. Her only thought was to escape. So, scrambling to her feet, she ran from the bedroom door, and her vision now was blurry with tears and blood. And scarily, George was right behind her, shouting incoherently, and the knife still clenched in his hand like something from a horror movie. So Maria burst out of the bedroom and ran into the hallway, her bare feet slapping against the wooden floor. She could hear George's heavy footsteps right behind her, growing closer with every footstep. But at this point, the front door was only a few feet away, but it felt like an eternity to reach. Her fingers fumbled with the lock as George's shadow loomed right over her. And finally, the door swung open, and Maria threw herself outside, screaming for help at the top of her lungs. And she bolted to the nearest house, banging on the door until the neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, opened the door. One look at Maria's blood-soaked nightgown and her terrified face was enough. Mrs. Thompson immediately ushered her inside and called the police. And as Maria was waiting, she just collapsed onto the floor, her body trembling violently as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. She had survived. Somehow, some way, she had survived. And then the police arrived within minutes, finding George wandering aimlessly in the street, the bloody knife still in his hand. And he was immediately arrested, and his once calm and collected demeanor was replaced by a vacant, haunted look, as if something possessed him. Seriously, it was as if he had been possessed by something dark and malevolent, something that had drove him to attempt the unthinkable. But it turns out this wasn't a possession, because during the trial, the full extent of George's plan was revealed. And he had been meticulously planning Maria's murder for weeks, carefully choosing the night when he would finally carry it out. There were no warning signs, no red flags. Maria had been completely unaware of the danger she was about to be in until the moment she woke up with a knife in her chest. But what truly shocked everyone was the account of Maria's dream. The prosecution at this point argued that it was nothing more than a coincidence, a product of an overactive imagination, but Maria knew better. She believed with every fiber of her being that that nightmare had saved her life. It was as if some unseen force had intervened, pulling her out of the dream and into reality at the exact moment she needed it the most to survive. George was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 15 years in prison. And he showed absolutely no remorse, no regret for anything that he had done. Maria, on the other hand, was left to now pick up the pieces of her shattered life. I mean, the physical wounds, would heal with time, but the psychological scars ran deep, and she could no longer sleep without fearing the nightmare would return or that George would somehow find a way to finish what he had started. For years, Maria's story was told, and some saw it as a terrifying coincidence, but others believed that Maria had actually been touched by something supernatural, something that had warned her of impending danger. Whatever the truth may be, one thing is for certain: Maria would never forget the night her nightmare became a horrible reality. I want you to imagine right now, before pressing the like button, actually never mind, press the like button right now. Thank you. And I want you to imagine right now if you could see your own death. Yes, if you closed your eyes one day, had a dream, and then all of a sudden said, oh my God, I'm gonna die on this day in this way. Do you think you would be able to somehow intervene with fate and prevent it? Well, whether you do or you don't, listen to this story. In the quiet village of Aberfam, nestled in the Welsh valleys, life moved at a gentle pace. And the year was 1966, and the village was home to a close-knit community where everybody else knew everybody else by name. And among these residents was a bright and cheerful 10-year-old girl named Maria Jones. Maria was known for her infectious laughter and her love for school, particularly her fascinations with stories and dreams. Errol May lived with her parents in this modest home not far from Pengalla's junior high, where she was a student. Her mother, Anne, often marveled at her daughter's vivid imagination and the peculiar dreams that she would recount each morning. But one dream in particular would haunt Anne forever. So it was a chilly October morning when May came to her mother and had a strange, unsettling dream. "Mummy," she said, her voice was kind of trembling slightly this time, "I had a dream about a big black cloud coming down over the school. It was so dark and scary. I don't want to die, Mummy." Anne, taken back by her daughter's words, tried to comfort her. "You're too young to be talking about dying, May. It was just a bad dream. Now, how about a lollipop?" she said, hoping, to distract her, but the unease lingered in the back of her mind. And luckily, the following days passed without incident, but Anne couldn't, shake that feeling that something was terribly wrong. And May continued to go to school, her usual cheerful self, but the memory of her dream stayed with her. And then, on the morning of October 21st, 1966, May left for school, as usual, her red coat buttoned up tightly against this autumn chill, and she waved goodbye to her mother, who watched her walk down the street, her heart heavy with this inexplicable dread. See, this junior school was bustling with activity that morning. Children filled the classrooms, their laughter echoing through the halls. May sat at her desk, and her mind started wandering back to that dream that she had that unsettled her. And she tried to, shake it off and just focus on her lessons that were going on, but a sense of foreboding hung over her like a dark cloud. And at 9:15 a.m., the unthinkable happened. A massive landslide of coal waste, destabilized by heavy rains, broke loose from the tip above the village, and this black slurry roared down the mountainside, gaining speed and momentum as it approached Aberfan. The ground trembled almost as if it was an earthquake, and a deafening roar filled the air. And sadly, inside the school, the children and the teachers had absolutely no time to react. The black wave of coal waste just crashed into the building, engulfing everything in its path. Classrooms were buried under tons of debris, and the once lively school was plunged into darkness and chaos. Anne was at home when she heard the news. The radio kind of crackled with reports of a disaster at the junior school. So her heart raced, and then she just ran out of the house, joining the throngs of villagers rushing towards the school to see if their children were okay. The scene that greeted them was one of utter devastation. The school at this point was buried under a thick layer of coal waste, and at this moment the air was filled with the cries of parents that were searching for their children. And rescue efforts began immediately, with villagers, miners, and emergency services working tirelessly to dig through the debris. Anne even joined in the search, her hands raw and bleeding as she clawed at the cold waste, desperate to find her daughter. Hours turned into an agonizing eternity as they pulled bodies from the wreckage, each discovery a heartbreaking confirmation of a tragedy. And as night fell, the workers continued their grim task under the harsh glare of floodlights, and Anne refused to leave. Her hope was dwindling with each passing hour. But finally, in the early hours of the morning, they found May. Unfortunately, she was lifeless. Her small body was crushed under the weight of all this coal waste. Anne's heart immediately shattered as she cradled her daughter, and the memory of May's dream was just echoing in her mind. And the whole village of Aberfan was plunged into mourning. The disaster claimed the lives of 144 people, including 116 children. We should be taught things like this in school because the loss was unimaginable, and the community was left to grapple with the overwhelming grief and the haunting question of whether the tragedy could have been prevented. But in the days that followed, stories of premonitions and dreams began to surface and circulate. May's dream was not the only one. Other children had spoken to their family about similar visions, and some parents had even experienced unsettling feelings of dread, just like Anne. These coincidences were too striking to ignore, and the village was left to wonder if these premonitions were a warning that had gone unheeded. The Aberfan disaster became a symbol of the devastating consequences of negligence and the failure to heed warnings. Investigations actually revealed that the coal waste tip had been unstable for years, and the heavy rains obviously exacerbated that danger. And the National Coal Board was found to be responsible, and the disaster led to significant changes in mining regulations and safety practices. But for Anne Jones, the loss of her daughter was a wound that would never heal. She did find solace, though, in the memories of May's laughter and the dreams that had once filled their home with wonder. May's story is an important reminder of the fragility of life and the mysterious ways in which the human mind can sense impending danger. A lot of this happens to people all the time, and they notice small things, bad situations. It's actually called spatial knowledge. And May's dream was a chilling premonition of this disaster, and it serves as a testament to the power of intuition and the importance of listening to our inner selves. So like I asked you at the beginning of this story, if you were to see your own fate, would you just think, oh, it's a coincidence, it's a dream, it's just a dream? Or, after hearing this story, would you heed the warning? This story I go on more about in the end, and you'll see why, and I want some of you to leave a comment if you remember anything. So, Maria Martin was a young woman of beauty and charm living in the quiet village of Polstead, Suffolk, England. Her life, however, was far from serene, and this dates back to 1827. Maria's story would become one of the most infamous and chilling tales of the 19th century, known as the Red Barn Murder. You see, it all started when Maria had been in a relationship with a man named William Corder. And he was a man of questionable character, and their relationship was fraught with secrecy and scandal, as Maria had given birth to a child out of wedlock, a situation that was totally socially unacceptable at that time. And even despite the societal pressures, Maria and William planned to get married and start a new life together. But one fateful evening, Maria and William arranged to meet at the Red Barn, which was a local landmark that had become their secret rendezvous point. Maria was dressed in this distinctive red shawl, and she slipped out of her family home, her heart, pounding with a mix of excitement and trepidation. But little did she know that this would be the last time she would be seen alive. So as Maria slipped out of the house and eventually walked right into the barn, the atmosphere all of a sudden grew thick with unexpected tension. The barn was usually a place of solace for the couple. Now it felt ominous and foreboding. And as she opened the door and went in, William was already there, unusually, cold and distant. At this point, Maria's unease grew, but she kind of pushed it to the side, focusing on their plans for the future. Then, without warning, William's expression twisted into one of malevolent intent. And I know this because he then produced a pistol, and before Maria could even react, he shot her. The sound of the gunshot echoed through this small barn, a chilling prelude to the horror that would eventually follow. William, driven by a dark and twisted motive, buried Maria's body beneath the barn floor, hoping, to conceal his heinous act. And it worked for a while because months passed by. And Maria's family grew, of course, increasingly worried about her sudden disappearance. But William maintained a facade of concern, concocted these various stories to explain her absence. However, Maria's stepmother was also haunted by these vivid and disturbing dreams, and she became convinced that something terrible had happened to her stepdaughter. Now, as you can notice, all of these stories have to do with dreams and premonitions. So if you have any strange dreams or premonitions that could be a story, please let me know in the comments. But in her dreams, Maria's stepmother saw visions of a red barn and felt this overwhelming sense of dread. And she even shared her fears with Maria's father, who, was skeptical, but then agreed to investigate. So together they searched the barn, and their hearts were, kind of heavy with anticipation and fear. And as they dug beneath the barn floor, their worst fears came true. Maria's lifeless body was unearthed, her red shawl still wrapped around her. And this discovery sent shockwaves through the village, and the hunt for her killer began in earnest. And of course, William Corder was now the prime suspect, but he, of course, fled the village. But he couldn't escape justice yet. He was eventually captured and brought to trial. And when he was, the courtroom was packed with spectators, all eager to witness the unfolding drama. The evidence against William was very, very damning, and his guilt was undeniable. I promise you, you're going to want to stick around for the ending. During this trial, the full extent of William's deceit and cruelty was revealed. He had meticulously as well planned Maria's murder, driven by a desire to rid himself of the complications that she posed in his life. And the prosecution painted a chilling picture of a man devoid of remorse whose only concern was self-preservation. I mean, think about it, this was 200 years ago. Crimes like this just really didn't happen. And the jury was horrified by all the details of the crime. So they swiftly delivered a guilty verdict. And William Corder was sentenced to death. And his execution was carried out in front of a large crowd. And they were eager to see justice served. Now, the true details and the more unexpected things about the Red Barn murder, not to mention what happens to William, will absolutely shock you. All I can say, if you're a longtime fan, you already know what happened. But if you don't know what happened, I actually tell the full story on my very first collab right here. And you should watch it because the other story with the person I collab with, Strange Bar and Grill, His story was absolutely phenomenal. I wanted to steal it, to be honest, once I heard it. But if you haven't seen it, check it out right now. I love you guys. That's all I got for you today. Hit the like button. I'll see you later, and peace.